The television camera rolled as Commander Jeremiah Denton's bruised face filled screens across America on May 17, 1966. Behind his swollen eyes lay a secret that would take months for intelligence analysts to decode. Every blink was deliberate. Torture. The clanging of metal doors echoed through Hoa Lo Prison's corridors that morning, mixing with the acrid smell of mold and human waste that permeated every brick wall. The rough concrete beneath prisoners' feet had worn smooth from decades of shuffling steps, first by French colonial inmates, now by American airmen who had never imagined they would call this place home. The North Vietnamese had orchestrated this propaganda interview to demonstrate their humane treatment of captured pilots. But Denton had just transmitted the first verified intelligence about conditions inside what American prisoners had begun calling the Hanoi Hilton. The irony was deliberate. Nothing about Hoa Lo resembled luxury. Built by French colonial authorities in 1896 to house Vietnamese revolutionaries, the prison's design reflected colonial brutality perfected over generations. Thick brick walls rose 20 feet high, topped with broken glass and razor wire. Guard towers positioned at each corner provided overlapping fields of fire across the central courtyard. The architecture spoke of permanence, of a place designed to break spirits as efficiently as it confined bodies. When the first American pilot arrived on August 5, 1964, Lieutenant Everett Alvarez Jr. stepped into a facility that had been modified specifically for a new kind of prisoner. The French had used Hoa Lo to suppress Vietnamese independence movements. Now the North Vietnamese would use it to extract propaganda value from captured American airmen while breaking their will to resist. The cells measured 7 feet by 5 feet, smaller than most American bathrooms. Lieutenant Commander John McCain would later describe his first night in one of these concrete boxes. The walls wept moisture in the humid Hanoi climate, creating a perpetual dampness that soaked through prison-issued pajamas and into bones. A single bare bulb burned continuously, casting harsh shadows that eliminated any distinction between day and night. The wooden plank that served as a bed was exactly 18 inches wide. Turn over, and you risked falling onto the concrete floor. But the physical conditions, harsh as they were, represented only the surface layer of a systematic program designed to destroy American military culture from within. The North Vietnamese had studied captured Chinese manuals on prisoner indoctrination from the Korean War. They understood that breaking a pilot's body was temporary. Breaking his mind was permanent. The guards spoke in whispers, their rubber sandals making no sound on the prison floors. This silence was intentional, designed to heighten every unexpected noise into a source of terror. Metal doors slammed. Prisoners would jump despite months of conditioning. When keys rattled against cell locks, hearts would race with the knowledge that interrogation was coming. What would you do if your only choice was between betraying your country and enduring torture that might last years? By 1965, as Operation Rolling Thunder escalated American bombing campaigns across North Vietnam, the population of Hoa Lo began to swell. F-105 Thunderchief pilots, flying the most dangerous missions of the war, comprised the majority of new arrivals. These men had been trained for air-to-air combat and precision bombing. Nothing in their military education had prepared them for the psychological warfare they would face as prisoners. The North Vietnamese understood something that American military planners had overlooked. Every captured pilot represented potential propaganda value worth more than a destroyed aircraft. A broken American officer confessing to war crimes on television could influence public opinion in ways that battlefield victories could not achieve. Before we continue into the darkness of what these men endured, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. These stories of resilience deserve to be heard everywhere, so please hit that like button and subscribe to help us share them. The transformation began immediately upon capture. Flight suits were confiscated and replaced with gray prison pajamas. Dog tags disappeared into evidence bags. Personal effects, including photographs of wives and children, vanished into administrative files. The message was clear. Your identity as an American officer no longer exists. Captain James Stockdale, the highest-ranking naval officer captured during the war, would later write that the first 72 hours determined whether a man would survive psychologically intact. The North Vietnamese used this window to establish dominance through calculated disorientation. Prisoners were moved between cells without explanation. Meal schedules changed randomly. Sleep was interrupted by interrogations at unpredictable intervals. Yet something unexpected happened in those concrete cells. Instead of breaking individually, the Americans began to connect. The tap code became their lifeline to sanity. Developed by Captain Carlisle Harris during his own captivity, the system assigned each letter of the alphabet a numerical position in a 5x5 grid. A for 1-1, B for 1-2, and so forth. Prisoners would tap on walls, pipes, or floors using this cipher, creating an underground communication network that the guards struggled to detect. Through these coded messages, isolated men learned they were not alone. More importantly, they began to organize. But the North Vietnamese had prepared countermeasures that would test every limit of human endurance. In the isolation cells of Hoa Lo, a battle was beginning that would determine not just who survived, but who returned home with honor intact. The real war was just beginning. The rhythmic tapping began at 2:17 in the morning on November 3, 1966, echoing through the ventilation system like a mechanical heartbeat. To the guards, it sounded like settling pipes or restless prisoners shifting against their wooden planks. To the Americans, it was revolution. How do you build an army when every soldier is locked in solitary confinement, and speaking above a whisper means weeks in leg stocks? The answer lay in those calculated taps, each one representing a letter, each sequence carrying intelligence that would transform isolated prisoners into a coordinated resistance network. Captain Carlisle Harris had smuggled the tap code into Hoa Lo from his previous captivity, but it was Navy Commander James Stockdale who recognized its true potential as a weapon against psychological warfare. The putrid smell of fish sauce and fermented vegetables drifted through the cell blocks during the morning meal distribution, mixing with the metallic tang of rust from aging water pipes. Guards moved through corridors with deliberate quiet, their rubber sandals creating only the faintest whisper against polished concrete floors worn smooth by decades of shuffling feet. The texture of these walls had become intimately familiar to prisoners, who spent hours each day pressed against them, transmitting messages one letter at a time. Stockdale established what became known as the underground command structure through these coded communications. Despite being physically separated, he could issue orders, coordinate resistance, and maintain military discipline among men who had been scattered across dozens of cells throughout the prison complex. The tap code carried more than letters. It carried hope. The system worked through a 5x5 grid that eliminated the letter K to create 25 positions. A prisoner would tap once, pause, then tap once again to signal the letter A in position 1-1. B became 1-2, F became 2-1, and so forth. Complex messages required patience and practice, but within months, Experienced tappers could transmit at nearly conversational speed. Through these walls, Stockdale learned the names of every American prisoner in Hoa Lo. He discovered who had been captured, when, and under what circumstances. More importantly, he began to coordinate response to interrogation techniques that had been refined through trial and error on Chinese prisoners during the Korean War. The North Vietnamese interrogation protocol followed a predictable pattern designed to exploit cultural weaknesses they had identified in captured Americans. Phase 1 involved isolation and disorientation, lasting anywhere from 1 week to 3 months. Phase 2 introduced physical coercion calibrated to approach, but not cross the line into permanent injury. Phase 3 offered relief in exchange for cooperation with propaganda efforts. What they had not anticipated was American adaptability. Lieutenant Commander John McCain discovered this during his own introduction to North Vietnamese hospitality. Shot down on October 26, 1967, McCain arrived at Hoa Lo with a broken leg, 2 broken arms, and internal injuries that should have killed him. The North Vietnamese medical staff provided just enough treatment to keep him alive while maximizing his suffering. McCain's father was Admiral John S. McCain, Jr., commander of all American forces in the Pacific. This connection made the younger McCain a prize worth more than a dozen ordinary pilots. The North Vietnamese offered him early release, a propaganda victory that would demonstrate their humanitarian treatment of prisoners while driving a wedge between captured Americans. McCain refused. The principle had been established through tap code communications months earlier. Return with honor meant no American would accept early release ahead of prisoners who had been captured earlier. This policy, transmitted through concrete walls 1 letter at a time, created an unbreakable chain of solidarity that the North Vietnamese could not anticipate or counter. But they could punish it. The torture chamber known as the Blue Room occupied a corner of the prison complex where screams could be contained and witnesses eliminated. The walls showed stains that soap could not remove, and the air carried the metallic scent of old blood mixed with disinfectant. Prisoners who emerged from the Blue Room moved differently, their shoulders carrying invisible weight that would never fully lift. Captain James Stockdale endured 4 years in the Blue Room and its variations. His medical records, declassified decades later, documented injuries consistent with systematic torture designed to break psychological resistance while avoiding obvious permanent damage. Dislocated joints that healed improperly. Ligament damage from prolonged stress positions. Malnutrition that reduced his body weight from 170 pounds to 93 pounds. Yet the tap code continued. Even while undergoing torture, Stockdale used brief moments when guards stepped away to transmit intelligence about interrogation techniques, guard schedules, and propaganda requirements. This information, passed through the network, allowed other prisoners to prepare psychologically for what awaited them. The guards eventually discovered the tap code, but not before it had accomplished something unprecedented in the history of prisoner of war camps. It had created an organized military unit operating under discipline and command structure despite complete physical separation. The North Vietnamese response was swift and brutal. Anyone caught communicating faced immediate punishment in isolation cells that measured 4 feet by 4 feet, too small to lie down, too low to stand upright. Prisoners would spend weeks in these boxes, surviving on minimal water and food while battling infection from untreated wounds. Still, the network persisted. New communication methods emerged as quickly as old ones were discovered. Prisoners developed a coughing code for transmitting simple messages during propaganda broadcasts, when all cells could hear. They created hand signals visible through cracks in door frames during the brief moments when guards opened cells for cleaning. They even embedded coded messages in forced confessions, knowing that fellow prisoners would recognize the patterns and extract intelligence. The most remarkable development was the emergence of what prisoners called return with honor as more than policy. It became a philosophy that transformed capture from military failure into continued service. Captain Eugene McDaniel, shot down in May 1967, later wrote that the TAP code taught him something no military training had conveyed. Resistance was not about individual heroics. It was about collective endurance. Every man who refused to cooperate, who maintained discipline, who supported his fellow prisoners through coded messages, was striking a blow against enemy propaganda more effectively than any bombing mission. By 1968, the prison contained over 400 American airmen, and the underground communication network had evolved into something the North Vietnamese could not destroy. They could isolate individual prisoners, but they could not isolate the community those prisoners had created through tapped messages and shared sacrifice. The revolution had succeeded beyond even Stockdale's expectations. But the North Vietnamese were preparing a counteroffensive that would test every bond these men had forged in darkness. The real battle for their souls was about to begin. The loudspeaker crackled to life at 6:30 on the morning of October 14, 1969, broadcasting a message that would shatter the fragile equilibrium prisoners had built over 4 years of captivity. All American criminals will now participate in patriotic education or face consequences for their stubborn attitudes. The sound of shuffling feet echoed through cell blocks as guards moved with unusual urgency, their voices sharp with anticipation. The smell of fresh paint drifted from the direction of the interrogation rooms, mixed with the acrid odor of electrical equipment being tested. Prisoners who had learned to read the texture of their captors' moods through the weight of footsteps and the rhythm of door slams recognized something different. This was preparation for war. The North Vietnamese had reached a breaking point with their American prisoners, and they were about to deploy their most sophisticated weapon yet. For months, intelligence reports had filtered back to Hanoi describing the underground resistance network operating within Hoa Lo Prison. Despite systematic efforts to break communication, despite isolation cells and torture sessions, the Americans continued to operate as a military unit. They followed orders transmitted through tapped codes. They maintained discipline under the most extreme conditions. They refused to cooperate with propaganda efforts that could have shortened their captivity. Most importantly, they were winning. Every refused confession, every maintained silence under torture, every display of solidarity represented a propaganda defeat for the North Vietnamese. The war was being fought on multiple fronts, and in the battle for hearts and minds, American prisoners were proving that communist indoctrination could not break men who had something stronger than ideology to sustain them. They had each other. Colonel Robinson Reisner discovered the extent of North Vietnamese frustration during an interrogation session that lasted 14 hours without interruption. His interrogator, a man prisoners had nicknamed the Rabbit for his nervous energy and twitching movements, had abandoned all pretense of following the Geneva Convention guidelines that typically governed prisoner treatment. "You think your tap code makes you clever," the Rabbit had screamed, spittle flying across the wooden table that separated them. "You think your American solidarity makes you strong. We will show you how wrong you are." The new campaign began with the introduction of cooperation rewards, designed to drive wedges between prisoners who had maintained unity through shared suffering. Prisoners who agreed to write statements criticizing American involvement in Vietnam would receive improved food, additional clothing, and male privileges that had been denied for years. Those who refused would face escalated punishment in isolation cells where communication was impossible. The tap code network transmitted Stockdale's response within hours. No deals, no cooperation, no statements. Return with honor. But the North Vietnamese had prepared for this resistance. If they could not break the prisoners individually, they would create conditions that made collective resistance impossible. Lieutenant Commander Richard Stratton learned the new rules on November 2, 1969, when guards dragged him from his cell to a room where cameras had been positioned to record his confession. The session lasted 18 hours. When he refused to cooperate, they applied pressure to healing injuries from his shoot-down. When physical pain proved insufficient, they introduced psychological torture designed to exploit every vulnerability they had identified during months of observation. The guards had cataloged which prisoners talked in their sleep, revealing names of family members, home addresses, childhood fears. They knew which men suffered from claustrophobia, which ones had recurring nightmares about the circumstances of their capture, which ones showed signs of breaking under isolation. They used all of it. Captain James Stockdale faced his own crisis of leadership when the rabbit informed him that continued resistance from his men would result in the execution of the 3 most junior officers in the prison. The threat was delivered with bureaucratic precision, complete with documentation that appeared to show legal authorization for such measures under North Vietnamese military law. What would you do if saving your fellow prisoners required abandoning everything you believed about duty and honor? Through the tap code network, Stockdale learned that similar ultimatums were being delivered to senior officers throughout the prison complex. The North Vietnamese had identified the command structure that governed American resistance and were systematically applying pressure designed to collapse it from within. The psychological warfare reached its peak during the Christmas season of 1969. Prisoners who agreed to record anti-war statements would be allowed to send recorded messages to their families. Those who refused would receive notification that their families had been informed they were missing and presumed dead. For men who had not communicated with their wives and children for years, who had missed birthdays and anniversaries and graduations, the temptation was overwhelming. Some broke. Captain Eugene McDaniel later described the sound that echoed through the prison when the first man agreed to cooperate. It was not the victory celebration the guards had anticipated. It was silence. Complete, devastating silence from cells that had buzzed with tapped messages for months. The network was fracturing, but instead of collapse, something unexpected happened. The prisoners who maintained their resistance began to tap more frequently, sending messages of support to those who had broken, reminding them that cooperation under torture was not betrayal but human limitation. They adapted their code to include forgiveness. The most remarkable transformation occurred in the cells of prisoners who had given propaganda statements under extreme duress. Instead of isolation and shame, they found acceptance from fellow prisoners who understood that every man had limits, that survival sometimes required compromises that honor would have to accommodate. Lieutenant Commander John McCain, who had himself come close to breaking during his own torture sessions, became one of the strongest voices advocating for compassion toward prisoners who had cooperated. Through tapped messages, he reminded his fellow captives that their mission was not to be perfect, but to endure, to return with honor intact, even if that honor had been tested beyond normal human capacity. The North Vietnamese discovered that their psychological warfare had produced an unintended consequence. Instead of destroying American solidarity, it had created something stronger than military discipline. It had created a brotherhood that could accommodate human frailty while maintaining collective strength. Honor meant coming home together. By early 1970, the prison population had stabilized around a new understanding of resistance that incorporated both defiance and mercy. The tap code network continued to operate, but its messages now carried something beyond military intelligence and orders. They carried forgiveness, encouragement, and the promise that no man would be left behind, regardless of what he had been forced to endure in the darkness of Hoa Lo. But the North Vietnamese were preparing one final test that would determine whether this brotherhood could survive when the stakes became life and death. The Sun Tay raid was coming, and everything these men had built together would hang in the balance. The transport aircraft engines roared to life on the tarmac at Gia Lam Airport on February 12, 1973, drowning out the sound of 591 men trying not to weep as they stepped into sunlight for the first time in years. After 8 years of captivity, freedom felt like sensory overload. The sweet smell of jet fuel mixed with the humid Vietnamese air carried scents these men had forgotten existed. Tropical flowers, cooking food from nearby villages, and the metallic tang of aircraft that represented salvation rather than destruction. The aluminum steps leading up to the C-141 Starlifter transport planes felt solid beneath feet that had known only concrete and wooden planks for years. Some prisoners paused halfway up the stairs, overwhelmed by the simple sensation of moving forward without permission. What they were leaving behind would haunt American foreign policy for generations, but what they carried with them would redefine the meaning of survival. The Paris Peace Accords, signed on January 27, 1973, had secured their release through negotiations that acknowledged what battlefield victories could not achieve. North Vietnam would return American prisoners in exchange for complete withdrawal of United States forces and recognition that the war had ended in stalemate rather than victory. For the men boarding those aircraft, political outcomes mattered less than the fact that their brotherhood had endured long enough to bring them all home together. Captain James Stockdale, now a rear admiral, walked up the aircraft stairs with a limp that would never fully heal and a dignity that 8 years of torture could not break. The tap code network he had commanded through concrete walls had accomplished something unprecedented in military history. Despite systematic efforts to divide them, despite individual moments of weakness under extreme duress, the prisoners had maintained unit cohesion without traditional command structures or external support. They had kept faith with each other when keeping faith seemed impossible. Lieutenant Commander John McCain followed behind Stockdale, his white hair and gaunt frame making him appear decades older than his 36 years. The injuries from his shoot-down had never properly healed, leaving him with restricted arm movement that would affect him for life. But he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had discovered that physical limitations could not diminish spiritual strength. The Sun Tay raid, which had promised rescue 18 months earlier, had failed to find any American prisoners at its target location. But its psychological impact had reverberated through every cell in Hoa Lo Prison. The knowledge that America had not forgotten them, that rescue missions were being planned and executed, had sustained morale during the darkest periods of their captivity. They had mattered enough to risk American lives trying to save them. As the aircraft lifted off Vietnamese soil, many prisoners pressed their faces against windows for a final look at the country that had held them captive. The landscape below showed bomb craters alongside rice paddies, testimony to a war that had consumed both nations for over a decade. Some felt anger at the sight. Others felt something approaching pity for a people who had endured even more suffering than they had experienced as prisoners. Most felt profound relief that the killing was finally over. The flight to Clark Air Base in the Philippines took 4 hours, But for men who had measured time in years rather than hours, it passed like a brief dream. Medical personnel aboard the aircraft conducted preliminary examinations, documenting the physical toll of prolonged captivity. The average weight loss among prisoners was 47 pounds. Many showed signs of malnutrition, untreated injuries, and psychological trauma that would require years of treatment. But they were alive, and they were together. The homecoming at Clark Air Base provided the first glimpse of how profoundly America had changed during their absence. Television crews documented every step of their arrival, broadcasting images of walking skeletons who somehow stood with military bearing despite their condition. The American public, exhausted by years of divisive war coverage, found in these returning prisoners something they desperately needed: heroes who had endured rather than conquered. Captain Eugene McDaniel later described the surreal experience of learning about events that had occurred during his captivity: the moon landing, Woodstock, campus protests, the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy. The prisoners had left an America confident in its military supremacy and moral authority. They returned to a nation questioning both. Yet their story provided something the divided country could unite around. The congressional hearings that followed their return documented torture techniques that violated every provision of the Geneva Convention. Prisoners testified about systematic psychological warfare designed to break their resistance to propaganda efforts. They described medical neglect that bordered on deliberate cruelty and isolation techniques that pushed men to the edge of sanity. But they also testified about something their captors had never intended to create: a brotherhood forged in darkness that proved stronger than ideological division. The tap code had evolved beyond communication into something approaching sacrament. The simple act of tapping messages through concrete walls had become a daily affirmation that they were not alone, that someone cared enough to risk punishment for making contact, that their value as human beings transcended their usefulness as propaganda tools. Years later, when these men gathered for reunions, they would recreate that tapping ritual. Not from nostalgia for their suffering, but from reverence for what they had discovered about human resilience under impossible conditions. Admiral James Stockdale received the Medal of Honor in 1976 for his leadership during captivity. His citation read simply, "By his exceptional leadership, superior tactics, and extraordinary valor, he distinguished himself above and beyond the call of duty." But Stockdale himself always insisted that the real heroes were the men who had maintained that tap code network day after day, year after year, when hope seemed pointless and resistance appeared futile. They had proven that honor was not about avoiding capture or escaping captivity. Honor was about returning together. The lesson echoed far beyond the walls of Hoa Lo Prison. In military academies, the story of the tap code became required study for officers who might face similar tests. In corporate boardrooms, business leaders analyzed how isolated individuals had maintained organizational cohesion under extreme stress. In psychological research, the prisoner experience provided insights into human resilience that continue to influence trauma treatment today. But perhaps the most profound impact was personal rather than institutional. These men had learned that survival was not an individual achievement, but a collective responsibility. They had discovered that strength came not from avoiding weakness, but from supporting each other through moments when weakness was inevitable. They had proven that faith, in country, in cause, in each other, could sustain human dignity even when human bodies were broken. The concrete walls of Hoa Lo Prison had been designed to isolate and destroy. Instead, they had become the foundation for one of the most remarkable examples of unity under adversity in human history. Today, when we face our own moments of isolation and testing, their tapped messages still echo. We are not alone. We matter to each other. We will return with honor. Some victories are measured not in territory captured or enemies defeated, but in the simple fact that brotherhood can survive anything totalitarian systems can devise to destroy it. The men who walked out of Hoa Lo Prison had won the most important battle of their lives. They had come home together.